It was a summer morning in Bridgetown, Tennessee. The sun had just risen, casting a soft golden light over the quiet town. The air was warm but not yet unbearable, and a slight breeze stirred the leaves of the trees outside. Inside his modest kitchen, Trump, at 87 years old, sat at the small wooden table, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug filled with steaming coffee. His once dark hair had long since turned silver, and the wrinkles on his face were deep, carved by decades of life, both in the military and after. His skin was dry and thin, showing the marks of age and the years of service he had given to his country. He had left behind the bustling life of a soldier and had settled in this quiet town, finding solace in the simplicity of daily routines. Through the window, he could see the rolling hills and the green expanse of farmland that stretched out toward the horizon. The view had been a part of his life for the past 40 years, ever since he had retired from the army and moved here. His body had aged, but the land, the hills, they had remained timeless in his eyes. The memories of his past still clung to him, sharp and vivid, but now they mingled with the peace of the present, a quiet life far removed from the chaos of battlefields. Every morning, after waking up to the slow creak of his joints and the lingering ache in his back from years of combat, Trump would take a moment to breathe in the stillness of the morning. He would sit at the table, his thoughts wandering, sometimes back to the war, sometimes forward to the day ahead. He had been through so much, too much perhaps, to ever truly forget. But here, in this small kitchen, there was a sense of refuge. The years had taken their toll on his body, but his spirit remained unbroken. His hands, though weathered and stiff, were still capable. They had once held weapons and tools of war, but now they worked the soil in his garden, fixing things around his house, or helping out with the local veterans projects. There was always something to be done, some task that needed his steady hands. He had never been one for idle time. As he sipped his coffee, his eyes wandered out the window again, and for a moment he let himself remember the days when he wore the uniform, when every decision mattered and every action was a step towards something greater. The years had blurred the sharp edges of those memories, but the feelings were still there: pride, loss, and the weight of responsibility. Trump had always been a man of few words, preferring actions to speech. His life had never been about seeking attention or glory. He did what needed to be done, whether it was on the battlefield or now, as he worked to support other veterans who had come home from wars of their own. His days were filled with small acts of service, whether fixing a wheelchair ramp for a neighbor or organizing a local fundraiser for veterans' needs. The town had come to know him, not as a hero or a man of grandeur, but as someone who had simply lived his life with honor and dignity. And that was enough. The world had moved on, and so had he, but in these quiet mornings, in this small kitchen overlooking the hills, Trump was content. The past was a weight he carried, but it no longer defined him. What mattered now was the present, the small moments of peace he had earned after a lifetime of service. He wasn't seeking any recognition for the things he did. He had never been one for that. He simply lived, and in his own way, he made the world a little better. As the morning light continued to pour in through the window, Trump finished his coffee, set the mug down gently on the table, and stood up. His bones creaked, but his step was steady. There was work to be done today. Trump started the engine of his old pickup truck, the one he had bought back in the 70s. He had always taken pride in this truck, a reliable companion that had been with him through thick and thin, even during his years of service. The truck was far from new, its exterior worn and faded, the interior showing signs of age. But to Trump, it wasn't just a vehicle. It was an extension of himself. Every scratch and dent told a story. Every turn of the key brought back memories of long drives and missions, of a life spent on the move. He could feel the engine hum beneath him, the vibrations of the road traveling up through the steering wheel. The truck had a personality, almost as if it were alive, and in a way, it was. It had been through battles of its own, just like him, and had come out the other side with scars to show for it. But it still ran, still carried him wherever he needed to go. As he drove down the familiar streets of Bridgetown, He felt the rhythm of the town settling into his bones. The town hadn't changed much over the years, and neither had he, at least not in the ways that mattered. He turned left onto Main Street, the truck's tires grumbling as they met the pavement. And that was when he saw them. 2 police cars, their lights flashing, parked at the side of the road. The vehicles blocked the street, and Trump's gaze shifted to the 2 officers standing beside them. They were young, their uniforms crisp and neat, their faces serious, though one of them wore a faint smile. Trump slowed the truck and pulled it over to the side of the road, coming to a stop behind one of the police cars. He didn't feel any tension, didn't sense any immediate danger. There was no need to. He had faced much worse in his life, and a routine traffic stop wasn't going to shake him. The officers approached his truck, one of them, tall, with a no-nonsense demeanor, motioning for him to lower the window. Trump did so slowly, his eyes scanning the 2 men. He could see the slight unease in their posture, the way they lingered just out of arm's reach, as though they were expecting something to go wrong. Trump wasn't bothered by their presence. He had dealt with people like them before, back when he was in the service. He knew how to handle authority, how to remain calm under pressure. In fact, he had spent most of his life doing just that. The years in special forces had taught him how to remain composed, no matter the situation. He didn't see the police officers as a threat. They were just doing their job, even if they didn't fully understand who they were dealing with. To them, he was just another old man in a beat-up truck. But to Trump, the world was much more complicated than that. The taller officer, the one who hadn't smiled, spoke first, his voice steady but lacking the warmth that might have put the situation at ease. He asked Trump for his license and registration, his tone formal, as though following a script. Trump's movements were deliberate, calm, as he reached into the glove compartment for the documents. The truck was his, and he had nothing to hide. He passed the papers to the officer, who glanced at them before returning his gaze to Trump's weathered face. The second officer, the shorter one, stood a little farther back, his gaze shifting between Trump and his partner. He had a relaxed air about him, though the tension in his body told a different story. He was younger, perhaps newer to the force, and Trump could tell that the officer was unsure of how to approach the situation. There was something about the way they carried themselves that told Trump they were more nervous than they let on, a sense of unease that reminded him of the young soldiers who had followed him in the field, unsure of what lay ahead. Trump's gaze remained steady as he waited for the officers to continue. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. The whole encounter felt almost trivial to him. He had been in situations where life and death were decided in an instant, where the stakes were far higher than a simple traffic stop. These officers, for all their training, for all their authority, were just doing their jobs, following protocols that had been set long before they were born. But Trump knew that sometimes protocols didn't capture the essence of a person, didn't take into account the history and the weight of what one had lived through. The younger officer stepped forward, his gaze lingering on the truck, the old man behind the wheel as though trying to size him up. Trump noticed the slight tremor in the officer's hands, the way he kept his distance. It was clear that neither of the officers truly understood who they were dealing with. They saw a frail, elderly man with a weathered face, a man who didn't seem to fit the profile of someone who had ever seen combat. But Trump had seen it all. He had seen things that would break most men, and he had lived to tell the tale. As the silence stretched, the older officer glanced at his partner, perhaps unsure of how to proceed. Trump didn't move, didn't shift in his seat. He was waiting, watching, allowing the officers to make their next move. He had been in countless situations where his calmness had been the deciding factor. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best course of action was to simply wait and let others reveal their hand. The younger officer took another step forward, this time speaking more softly, but his words were still laced with uncertainty. Trump could hear the slight crack in his voice, the hesitation that betrayed his nerves. The situation was quickly escalating from a simple stop to something more, but Trump didn't flinch. He had faced worse, much worse. The officers asked Trump to step out of the truck. Without hesitation, he complied, his movements slow but measured, a dignified grace in every step. The years of military training had taught him how to move without rushing, how to remain steady, even when the world around him was uncertain. As he stepped out, he noticed the officer's eyes lingering on his worn clothes, his faded jacket, the boots that had seen better days, the old frayed jeans. They were looking at him as if trying to find something amiss, something that didn't fit. But Trump didn't react. He didn't offer any explanation, didn't feel the need to justify himself. He had long learned that explanations often fell on deaf ears, especially when those on the other side weren't willing to listen. He had fought battles where survival itself was justification enough, where words were meaningless against the weight of experience. These officers weren't ready to hear the truth. They weren't prepared to understand what his life had been. One of the officers, the taller one, asked the standard question, "Do you have the registration papers for this vehicle?" Trump didn't speak. He reached into the glove compartment, pulling out the necessary documents with calm efficiency. He handed them over without a word. The officer glanced at the papers briefly before returning them, his expression unchanged, offering nothing but a curt nod. It wasn't the first time Trump had handed over papers without a word, and it wasn't likely to be the last. He had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than anything he could say. The officer stepped back a few paces, and Trump could hear them murmuring between themselves. Their voices were low, their words indistinct, but there was no mistaking the unease in their tone. Trump didn't interrupt. He stood still, watching the officers confer, his posture relaxed. He knew the drill. He had been through this kind of thing before, countless times in his life, but the tension in the air was palpable. The officers were unsettled, unsure. Trump could feel their eyes on him, their attempts to read him, to determine who he was, what he might be hiding. But the truth was, they were looking at the wrong man. They couldn't see beyond the surface, beyond the frail exterior, to the veteran who had seen more than most could imagine. The officers exchanged a few more words, stepping away from him for a moment to reassess the situation. Trump stayed where he was, hands at his sides, his face unreadable. He didn't show fear, didn't show frustration. He simply waited, letting them decide how to proceed. He wasn't concerned. He had been in more dangerous situations than this. But the growing discomfort between the officers was hard to ignore. They weren't sure how to handle him, how to handle someone like him, someone who had lived through things they could only guess at. After a few minutes, the officers returned. One of them, the taller one, approached Trump again with a slightly condescending air. He looked at the old truck, shaking his head. The officer stated, with a hint of authority, that in his opinion the vehicle appeared suspiciously old and poorly maintained. Trump could feel the tension in the air rise, thickening with each passing second. It wasn't just about the truck anymore. It wasn't even about the registration papers. This was about something deeper, something less obvious. He could see it in their eyes, the desire for control, the need to assert dominance over a man who, to them, was just an old man in a dilapidated vehicle. Trump recognized the game. He had seen it before. The old truck, the faded clothes, the slight stoop of his back, all of it made him an easy target. For some people, especially those who wore a badge, his age and his worn-out vehicle were an invitation to show power. He had dealt with such moments before, though not always in this context, but he had learned that when the situation started to turn, when the words became laced with a hint of hostility, it was time to either back down or make it clear that you wouldn't be intimidated. He had never been one to back down, not in the face of bullets, not in the face of war, and certainly not in the face of two officers who had decided he was the target of their authority. Trump, feeling his patience stretch thin, took a step forward. He made sure not to appear threatening, but there was a firmness in his movements, a quiet power that came from years of experience. His old joints ached with the effort, but his mind was clear. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but unyielding. He knew the look of power when he saw it, and he knew the type of man who relied on it to feel important. The words came out slow, deliberate, each one laced with the weight of his past. He told them that he had served in the army, that he had seen and endured more than they could ever imagine. He made it clear that if they needed to check something, he would comply, but he asked them not to turn the situation into something it wasn't. He expected respect, not power plays. But the officers were not swayed. They exchanged glances, and the shorter one, who had been quiet up until now, took a step toward him. There was a coldness in his voice when he said, "Get out, old man. We'll show you what needs to be done." It wasn't the first time Trump had heard such words, but it was the first time he had heard them in this context. Over a simple traffic stop, over a man they had decided to judge before ever truly seeing him. Trump felt his nerves tighten, his old body instinctively bracing for what was to come. But he didn't move. He didn't flinch. This was a test of patience, a test of strength, and it was a test he had faced before. He stood his ground, just as he had in the field, just as he had when confronted by enemies who didn't know him, who only saw a soldier or a target. His military training kicked in, and he remained still, his face unreadable. His heart beat in steady rhythm, steady as it had been during countless operations, where life and death were determined by a fraction of a second. He could feel the eyes of the officers on him, but he didn't react. The situation had escalated, but it had not yet reached its peak. Trump had lived through chaos, through moments where control was everything. This was just another moment, another challenge to remain composed, to show that no matter how old he was, no matter how they viewed him, he would not be rattled. He had faced worse. Suddenly, a black SUV appeared on the horizon, its government plates glinting in the morning sun. The vehicle rolled to a stop not far from where Trump was still standing, surrounded by the two officers. The doors opened, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out, his movements deliberate and confident. He ignored the police officers entirely, his eyes fixed on Trump. As he approached, there was no hesitation in his stride. It was clear he knew exactly where he was going. Without pausing, the man spoke in a clear, commanding voice that carried authority. He addressed the officers, his words concise and firm. "You've stopped the man who taught me everything. This is General Peterson." The officers, taken aback by the sudden appearance of the figure and the unexpected recognition, seemed to falter. The taller officer stammered slightly, his gaze shifting between the man in the suit and Trump, unsure of how to respond. General Peterson, without waiting for their reaction, continued his advance towards Trump. He reached out a hand to the older man, and Trump, recognizing the gesture of respect, accepted it with a steady grip. There was no warmth in the exchange, no signs of familiarity beyond the mutual understanding of two men who had been through the same kind of fire. The handshake was brief but filled with silent acknowledgement. Trump, ever stoic, did not display any visible emotion. The world around him had seen many changes, but his dignity and respect remained unchanged. He had lived a life where such moments of recognition were few, yet when they came, they were enough to remind him of his place in a larger history. This was their world now, one built on honor, dignity, and shared experiences. A world where what truly mattered was not the years that had passed, but the lives that had been saved and the sacrifices made. General Peterson, now standing next to Trump, turned back to the officers. His tone softened, but carried a weight that seemed to shift the very air around them. "This man saved my life in 1980 in Panama," he said, his voice steady but filled with unspoken gratitude. "If it hadn't been for him, I wouldn't be here today, standing in front of you." The words hit the officers like a wave. They had been caught in a routine, following protocol, assessing threats based on appearances. They hadn't known who they were dealing with. They hadn't understood the man they had stopped. The gravity of General Peterson's words sank in, and the realization began to settle in their minds. This wasn't just any old man in a truck. This was a veteran, a hero in ways they hadn't imagined, and now they were standing in the shadow of a legacy far greater than their own. The silence that followed was heavy. The officers, visibly shaken by the unexpected turn of events, exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed. But they knew, deep down, that whatever actions they had taken before were now irrelevant. They were no longer the ones in control. The man they had detained, the one they had underestimated, was someone far beyond their reach, someone who had earned respect in ways they could never comprehend. The police officer stood there, momentarily stunned by the gravity of the situation. One of them, still fumbling for words, tried to offer an apology, but General Peterson simply waved his hand, dismissing the gesture. There was no need for apologies, he made clear. The men who serve, the ones who have given so much, don't seek apologies. They seek understanding. People who serve don't require apologies, he stated firmly, his voice steady and calm. But you need to understand that you never know who's standing in front of you. The officers, unsure how to proceed, began to murmur among themselves. Their earlier confidence had all but evaporated. The power dynamics had shifted in an instant, and they were left grasping at the reality of the man they had just tried to subdue. They hadn't known. They hadn't understood. But now they were witnessing firsthand the quiet strength of someone who had lived a life beyond their comprehension. Trump and General Peterson exchanged a brief glance, a silent understanding passing between them. There was no need for words, no need for grand gestures. The moment was enough. Trump's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. It wasn't a smile of triumph or vengeance. It was a smile of quiet acceptance. He wasn't angry. He wasn't offended. He simply knew that there were things in this world, things of far greater value, that could never be understood by those who hadn't lived them. The officers, realizing the depth of the man they had mistaken for a simple old veteran, shifted uncomfortably. They had seen the power of respect, and now they were left to grapple with their own ignorance. The silence that lingered between them felt heavier than any apology could have been. When it was over, when the police officers had finally begun to retreat, Trump walked back to his truck. The old pickup creaked as he climbed behind the wheel. He wasn't looking for fame or recognition. He wasn't searching for validation. He wasn't interested in proving anything to anyone. His life had been one of service, of quiet dedication to the principles he had sworn to uphold long ago. And here, in the small town of Bridgetown, he was known. He was respected. That was more than enough. It was better than any apology, better than any public accolade. As the engine roared to life and the truck began to roll down the street, Trump didn't look back. The town he had served, the life he had lived, were all woven into the very fabric of who he was. He had nothing to prove, nothing to apologize for. He simply continued on, as he had always done, living his life, serving quietly, and leaving a legacy far deeper than any momentary recognition.